In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt traveled to a hilltop in southeastern Turkey near the city of Şanlıurfa. He was following up on a brief survey that had been conducted decades earlier in 1963 by a team from the University of Chicago and the University of Istanbul. That earlier team had noted the presence of broken limestone slabs on the hilltop and dismissed the site as a medieval cemetery. Schmidt looked at the same slabs and saw something else entirely. He saw worked stone, he saw deliberate shaping, he saw the edges of something enormous buried beneath the dust and scrub of an unremarkable hill called Gobekli Tepe, which means Potbelly Hill in Turkish. What Schmidt uncovered over the next 2 decades would become one of the most important archaeological discoveries in history. Beneath the surface of that hill lay a complex of massive stone structures consisting of T-shaped pillars, some standing more than 5.5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 metric tons, arranged in circles and decorated with elaborate carved reliefs of animals: lions, foxes, boars, vultures, serpents, scorpions, cranes. The carvings were detailed, confident, and clearly the work of experienced artisans who had spent years mastering their craft. The pillars were quarried from limestone bedrock, transported to the hilltop, erected in carefully prepared foundations, and arranged according to a plan that was, by any definition, architectural. And here is the fact that changed everything. According to radiocarbon dating of organic material found in the fill surrounding the structures, the oldest parts of Gobekli Tepe were built approximately 11,600 years ago. That is roughly 9,500 years before the Common Era. That is more than 6,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza, more than 6,000 years before the first pharaoh unified Egypt, more than 5,000 years before the earliest known cities of Mesopotamia, more than 4,000 years before the invention of the wheel. As far as we know, the structures at Gobekli Tepe were built at a time when, according to the standard model of human development, people lived in small, mobile groups of hunter-gatherers who had not yet developed agriculture, had not yet domesticated animals, had not yet invented pottery, and had not yet built permanent settlements of any significant size. Hunter-gatherers were not supposed to build monumental architecture. They were not supposed to quarry 10 metric ton stone pillars. They were not supposed to organize the labor required to transport, erect, and carve those pillars. They were not supposed to have the social complexity, the economic surplus, or the organizational capacity to undertake a construction project of this scale and ambition. And yet here it was, standing in the hills of southern Turkey, older than civilization itself, older than agriculture, older than everything we thought we knew about what humans could achieve before they settled down and started farming. Gobekli Tepe did not merely push back the timeline of monumental architecture, it inverted one of the foundational assumptions of archaeology, the assumption that agriculture came first and that complexity followed, that people had to farm before they could build, that they had to settle before they could organize, that civilization was the product of agriculture, not the other way around. Gobekli Tepe suggested the opposite, that the desire to build, to gather, to create something monumental may have come first, that the need to feed the workforce that built these structures may have driven the development of agriculture, rather than agriculture enabling the construction. The temple before the farm, the monument before the village, the ambition before the means. This is not a minor revision to the human story. This is a rewriting of the first chapter. And yet, outside the circles of professional archaeology and a modest following of enthusiasts, almost no one knows about it. The civilization, or proto-civilization, or whatever we choose to call the people who built Gobekli Tepe, is one of the most significant discoveries in the history of archaeology, and we barely talk about it. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds Gobekli Tepe in the popular imagination. It is not the silence of secrecy. The site has been published in academic journals, featured in documentaries, and discussed in popular science books. It is the silence of inconvenience. Gobekli Tepe does not fit the story we tell about human history. It does not fit the timeline. It does not fit the narrative of progress. It does not fit the assumption that civilization is a product of agriculture, that complexity is a product of settlement, that greatness is a product of technology. It stands before all of these things, older and stranger, and more accomplished than they allow. And because it does not fit, it is easier to mention it briefly and move on than to confront what it truly means. What it truly means is that we have been wrong, not about the details, about the story itself, the story of human development that most of us carry in our heads, the story of a long, slow climb from primitive simplicity to modern complexity is not supported by the evidence. The evidence shows something different, something more interesting, more humbling, and more beautiful. It shows that human beings have been capable of extraordinary things for far longer than we assumed. And it shows that the capacity for greatness is not something that was invented at a specific point in history. It is something that has been with us for as long as we have been ourselves. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand who these people were, what they built, why it matters, and what it tells us about the capabilities of human societies that existed thousands of years before Egypt, before Sumer, before any of the civilizations we learn about in school. You are going to see evidence that the conventional story of human development, the story of a steady climb from savagery to civilization, is incomplete. And you are going to confront a question that archaeologists are still struggling to answer. What else did these people build that we have not yet found? Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. Section 2. Antation and Quail. To understand why Gobekli Tepe matters, and why the people who built it deserve far more attention than they receive, we first need to understand the world they lived in. And the world of the 10th millennium before the Common Era was a world in transition. The last ice age was ending. The massive glaciers that had covered much of the northern hemisphere were retreating. Sea levels were rising. The climate was warming, and the landscapes of the ancient Near East were transforming from cold, dry steppe into something warmer, wetter, and more hospitable. The region where Gobekli Tepe stands, the upper reaches of the Fertile Crescent, in what is now southeastern Turkey, was one of the most ecologically rich areas on Earth during this transitional period. Wild grains, including the ancestors of modern wheat and barley, grew abundantly on the hillsides. Herds of wild game, including gazelles, aurochs, wild boar, and deer, roamed the grasslands and woodlands. The streams and rivers were full of fish. The forests provided timber, fruits, and nuts. It was a landscape of abundance, a landscape that could support relatively large populations of hunter-gatherers without the need for agriculture. This is a crucial point because it undermines the assumption that pre-agricultural people lived in constant scarcity. The standard narrative of human development, the one taught in most history textbooks, presents agriculture as a liberation from the hardships of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. People farmed because they had to, because hunting and gathering could not support large populations, because only agriculture could produce the surplus needed to support specialists, craftsmen, priests, and rulers. Gobekli Tepe challenges this narrative at its root, because it demonstrates that a pre-agricultural society in a rich environment could generate enough surplus labor to undertake a monumental construction project. The geological context of the site adds another dimension to the story. Gobekli Tepe sits at the boundary between the upper Mesopotamian plains and the foothills of the Taurus Mountains. This transitional zone between lowland and highland environments offered access to a wide range of resources. The lowland plains supported large herds of gazelles and wild cattle. The foothills provided wild nuts, fruits, and the ancestors of domesticated cereals. The rivers and streams offered fresh water and fish. This ecological diversity would have made the region attractive to hunter-gatherer communities, who could exploit multiple resource zones from a single base location. The limestone geology of the hilltop was itself a resource. The bedrock from which the pillars were quarried is a relatively soft, fine-grained limestone that could be worked with stone tools. The quarry area, located on the southwestern slope of the hill, shows clear evidence of the extraction process. Channels were cut around the intended pillar using stone picks, creating a rough blank that was then refined in place before being separated from the bedrock. The presence of multiple unfinished pillars in the quarry at various stages of completion, provides a detailed record of the manufacturing sequence. Some pillars were abandoned after cracking during extraction, others were abandoned at earlier stages, perhaps because of flaws in the stone that only became apparent during quarrying. The tool technology used at Gobekli Tepe was exclusively lithic, meaning it was based on stone. No metal tools have been found at the site or at any contemporary site in the region. The primary quarrying tools were flint picks, heavy stone hammers, and possibly stone chisels. The carving tools included smaller flint blades and pointed stone implements. The quality of the carving achieved with these tools is remarkable. The animal reliefs at Gobekli Tepe are three-dimensional, with figures standing out from the pillar surface in low and high relief. The details, individual feathers on birds, scales on snakes, tusks on boars, are rendered with a precision that implies years of practice and a deep familiarity with the medium. The absence of metal tools at Gobekli Tepe parallels the absence of metal at the Great Pyramid during the earliest stages of Egyptian stone construction. The Egyptians used copper, a relatively soft metal that provided only modest advantages over stone for cutting limestone. The builders of Gobekli Tepe did not even have copper. They worked exclusively with stone on stone, achieving results that are, in their own way, as impressive as anything the Egyptians produced with their soft metal tools. The comparison is not often made, but it should be. It reveals that the human capacity for precision stonework does not depend on metal. It depends on skill, patience, and the kind of practical knowledge that can only be developed through generations of sustained practice. The question of who built Gobekli Tepe in the most literal sense, what people, what culture, what language they spoke, remains largely unanswered. No human burials have been found at the site itself, though fragments of human bone have been identified in the fill material, and a carved skull with incised lines found during excavation has been interpreted as evidence of a skull cult, a practice of modifying and displaying human skulls that is documented at several PPNA and PPNB sites in the region. Without complete burials, ancient DNA analysis, which has revolutionized our understanding of population history in other regions, cannot be applied to the builders of Gobekli Tepe directly. What we can say is that the builders belonged to a population that had been living in the region for thousands of years before the site was constructed. Genetic studies of modern populations in the region, combined with ancient DNA from later Neolithic sites, suggest that the people of southeastern Turkey during the PPNA were part of a broader Near Eastern population that would eventually give rise to the early farming communities of the Fertile Crescent. They were not immigrants from elsewhere. They were indigenous to the region, descendants of hunter-gatherer populations that had occupied the area since at least the end of the last ice age, and probably much earlier. The language they spoke is completely unknown. Writing would not be invented for another 7,000 years, and there is no way to reconstruct the spoken language of a pre-literate population from archaeological evidence alone. Linguistic reconstruction, working backward from known language families, can reach back several thousand years at most. The language of the Gobekli Tepe builders is beyond the reach of any reconstruction method currently available. It was spoken, it was heard, it conveyed the stories and beliefs and practical instructions of a society capable of monumental achievement, and it has vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The social structure of the builders can be inferred only from the architectural and artifactual evidence. The scale of the construction implies organized leadership. The standardization of the pillar form implies shared conventions and possibly centralized design authority. The iconographic consistency across multiple enclosures implies shared beliefs and coordinated artistic production. But the nature of the leadership, whether it was secular or religious, hereditary or earned, individual or collective, is unknown. There are no palaces at Gobekli Tepe. There are no obviously elite residences. There is no evidence of extreme wealth concentration or conspicuous consumption. The site itself, the monument, is the community's investment. Not the display of a ruler, but the expression of a collective. The site itself covers approximately 9 hectares, though only a fraction has been excavated. Schmidt and his team, working under the auspices of the German Archaeological Institute, excavated from 1995 until Schmidt's death in 2014. Since then, work has continued under the direction of Lee Clare and other researchers. The excavations have revealed multiple layers of construction, with the oldest and most impressive structures at the bottom, buried beneath later, smaller, and less elaborate constructions. This stratigraphy, the layering of successive building phases, is itself significant. It indicates that the site was used and rebuilt over a period of at least 1,500 years, from approximately 9,500 to approximately 8,000 before the Common Era. The oldest structures, designated Layer 3 by the excavators, are the most monumental. They consist of circles of T-shaped limestone pillars, typically 12 or more pillars per circle, with two larger pillars standing in the center. The T-shape of the pillars has been interpreted as a stylized human form, with the crossbar representing the head and the upright representing the body. Some of the central pillars bear carved relief images of human arms and hands, with the arms folded across the front of the pillar, supporting the interpretation that the pillars represent human or human-like figures. The peripheral pillars in each circle are connected by stone walls and benches, creating enclosed spaces that could have served as gathering places, ritual venues, or both. The numbers are striking. The largest pillars discovered so far weigh approximately 10 metric tons. They were quarried from limestone outcrops located several hundred meters from the construction site, using stone tools, since the builders had no metal. The quarrying process involved cutting channels around the intended pillar in the bedrock, then separating the pillar from the underlying rock by driving wedges into the base. Several unfinished pillars have been found in the quarry, still attached to the bedrock, providing direct evidence of this process. One unfinished pillar, the largest found so far, measures approximately 7 meters in length and would have weighed an estimated 50 metric tons if completed. It was never finished, perhaps because it cracked during the quarrying process, but its existence demonstrates the ambition of the builders. Transporting a 10 metric ton stone pillar several hundred meters over uneven terrain without wheeled vehicles or draft animals is a formidable challenge. The methods used are not known with certainty, but experiments with similar stone-moving tasks suggest that wooden rollers, sledges, and large crews of laborers could have accomplished the task. Estimates of the labor required vary, but a commonly cited figure is that moving a single large pillar would have required the coordinated effort of several hundred people. This implies a social organization capable of mobilizing and directing large groups, an organizational capacity that was not previously attributed to pre-agricultural societies. The logistics of the construction deserve one more consideration. The hilltop location of Gobekli Tepe, while strategically and symbolically significant, was not the easiest place to build. The summit of the hill is approximately 760 meters above sea level, rising roughly 15 meters above the surrounding terrain. Transporting 10 metric ton stone pillars up a hillside, even a gentle one, adds significantly to the difficulty of the operation compared to building on flat ground. The choice of a hilltop location implies that elevation was important to the builders, perhaps for visibility, perhaps for symbolic reasons, perhaps for both. The water supply at the hilltop would have been limited. There are no natural springs on the summit of Gobekli Tepe, and the nearest reliable water sources are in the valleys below. Any large gathering of people at the site, whether for construction or for ritual, would have required the transport of water from lower elevations. This is not an insurmountable challenge, but it adds another dimension to the logistical complexity of the operation. The builders had to manage not just stone and labor, but also the basic necessities of food and water for a workforce operating in a location that did not naturally provide them. The choice to build in such a location, despite the logistical difficulties, tells us something about the builders' priorities. They valued the hilltop location highly enough to accept the additional costs of building there. The site was not chosen for convenience, it was chosen for meaning. Whatever the hilltop represented in the builder's worldview, it was worth the extra effort of hauling stone and water uphill. This is a pattern that recurs throughout the history of monumental construction. Sacred sites are rarely located in the most convenient places. They are located in the most meaningful places: mountaintops, river confluences, prominent headlands, places that speak to the human sense of significance, regardless of the practical difficulties they present. The carving of the pillars is equally impressive. The animal reliefs are not crude scratches. They are confident, detailed, three-dimensional carvings rendered in a style that shows clear artistic conventions and technical skill. The foxes have flowing tails and distinct facial features. The boars have bristling backs and curved tusks. The vultures spread their wings across the surface of the stone. The serpents coil and weave. Some pillars display multiple animals in apparent narrative scenes, including one famous pillar that shows a vulture apparently carrying a round object, interpreted by some researchers as a human head. The quality of the carving implies not just individual talent, but a tradition of artistic training. These were not first attempts. They were the products of a mature artistic tradition that had been developed over an unknown period. The food remains at Gobekli Tepe provide critical evidence about the subsistence economy of the builders. Faunal analysis of the animal bones found at the site, conducted by Joris Peters and his colleagues at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, has shown that the most commonly consumed animals were wild gazelles, aurochs, and wild sheep. There is no evidence of animal domestication in the faunal assemblage. The animals were hunted, not herded. The botanical evidence tells a similar story. The plant remains found at the site include wild einkorn wheat, wild barley, wild almonds, and wild pistachios, all collected from the natural environment rather than cultivated in fields. This evidence has two important implications. First, it confirms that the builders were hunter-gatherers, not farmers. Second, it indicates that the local environment was productive enough to support the large gatherings of people implied by the construction activities. The sheer volume of animal bone found at the site suggests large-scale feasting, possibly associated with the construction events or with ritual gatherings at the completed enclosures. Peters has estimated that the bone assemblage represents the remains of hundreds of individual animals, far more than would be consumed by a small resident population. This pattern is consistent with periodic gatherings, occasions when people from a wide area came together at Gobekli Tepe for communal activities that included feasting, ritual, and construction. The concept of feasting as a mechanism for organizing labor is well established in anthropology. In many traditional societies, leaders organize feasts to attract followers, to build social obligations, and to mobilize labor for communal projects. The surplus required for feasting does not have to come from agriculture. In a rich environment, it can come from organized hunting and gathering. The large-scale hunts of gazelles and aurochs that produced the bone assemblage at Gobekli Tepe may have been organized events, coordinated by leaders who used the resulting food surplus to attract labor for construction and to reinforce their social position through the distribution of meat and other goods. This model, feasting as a driver of social complexity and monumental construction, has been proposed by researchers including Brian Hayden and Michael Deitler and has been applied to Gobekli Tepe by several scholars. It provides a mechanism by which a pre-agricultural society could mobilize the labor required for monumental construction without the need for the agricultural surplus that the conventional model assumes. The labor was mobilized not through taxation or coercion, but through social obligation and the desire to participate in communal events that conferred social prestige, spiritual benefit, or both. The seasonal nature of the food resources in the region may have shaped the timing of construction activities. The gazelle migrations, the grain harvests, and the nut and fruit collections all followed seasonal patterns. Construction at Gobekli Tepe may have been seasonal, concentrated in periods when food was abundant and labor was available. This would be consistent with the practice known from many traditional societies of concentrating communal construction activities in the period after the harvest, when food is plentiful and agricultural labor is not required. To understand the scale of Gobekli Tepe relative to its contemporaries, consider what else was happening in the world at the time it was built. Around 9500 before the Common Era, the most advanced settlements in the Near East were small villages of simple, semi-subterranean structures, typically housing no more than a few dozen people. The settlement of Jericho, often cited as one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, was in its pre-pottery Neolithic A phase during this period, consisting of a collection of round stone houses with a population estimated at 200 to 300 people. Jericho had a stone tower, approximately 8.5 meters high, and a surrounding wall, both of which were impressive for their era. But the tower at Jericho was a single structure. Gobekli Tepe was a complex of multiple monumental enclosures, built and rebuilt over more than a millennium, using stones that dwarfed anything at Jericho. The pre-pottery Neolithic period, the era during which Gobekli Tepe was built, is divided by archaeologists into two main phases: the pre-pottery Neolithic A, or PPNA, lasting from approximately 9500 to approximately 8500 before the Common Era, and the pre-pottery Neolithic B, or PPNB, lasting from approximately 8500 to approximately 7000 before the Common Era. Gobekli Tepe spans both phases, with the monumental Layer 3 structures dating to the PPNA and the smaller Layer 2 structures dating to the PPNB. During the PPNA, settlements in the Fertile Crescent were typically small, consisting of clusters of round or oval semi-subterranean houses. The economy was based on hunting and gathering, with increasing evidence of plant management that would eventually lead to full domestication. The social organization is assumed to have been relatively egalitarian, with leadership based on personal qualities rather than inherited status. The PPNA is distinguished from earlier periods by the appearance of permanent or semi-permanent settlements, ground stone tools, and the earliest evidence of symbolic and ritual activity on a communal scale. The PPNB, by contrast, saw significant changes. Settlements became larger, houses changed from round to rectangular, the economy shifted toward increasing reliance on domesticated plants and, eventually, domesticated animals. Social differentiation appears to have increased, with some houses being larger and more elaborately furnished than others. Long-distance trade in obsidian, seashells, and other exotic materials expanded, and the ritual landscape changed, with the decline of the great pillar sites and the emergence of new forms of symbolic expression, including plastered human skulls, clay figurines, and painted walls. The transition from PPNA to PPNB at Gobekli Tepe is visible in the stratigraphy. The Layer 3 enclosures, with their massive central pillars and elaborate animal carvings, belong to the PPNA. The Layer 2 structures, which are smaller, with shorter pillars and simpler carvings, belong to the early PPNB. The decline in scale and elaboration from Layer 3 to Layer 2 mirrors the broader changes in the region, suggesting that the social and economic transformations of the PPNB period affected the way the site was used. The monumental tradition did not end abruptly. It diminished gradually over centuries, as the society that sustained it was transformed by the adoption of agriculture and the emergence of new forms of settlement and social organization. This pattern of diminishment is hauntingly familiar. We have seen it at the pyramids of Egypt, where the earliest examples are the most ambitious and the later examples show declining scale and precision. We have seen it at Angkor, where the greatest monuments were built during the empire's peak, and the later constructions were less impressive. The pattern suggests a general principle, that the most ambitious achievements of any cultural tradition tend to occur during the tradition's formative or peak phase, when the creative energy and organizational capacity are at their highest. The later phases, even if they persist for centuries, tend to be periods of consolidation, adaptation, and gradual decline. The comparison extends further. The first known cities of Mesopotamia, Eridu, Uruk, and Ur, would not emerge for another 5,000 years. The first Egyptian dynasty would not be established for another 6,500 years. The Great Pyramid of Giza would not be built for more than 7,000 years after the first stones were raised at Gobekli Tepe. In terms of time depth, Gobekli Tepe is closer to the last ice age than to the pyramids. It occupies a position in human history that is, for most people, essentially unimaginable. We have difficulty grasping time spans of centuries. Gobekli Tepe asks us to grapple with millennia, and this is the first reason we do not talk about it enough. It does not fit. It does not fit into the neat narrative of human progress that moves from the cave to the farm to the city to the empire. It sits before the beginning of that narrative, in a period that the narrative treats as a blank, a period of wandering, foraging, surviving, a period without monuments, without architecture, without complexity. Göbekli Tepe shatters that blankness. It fills it with carved stone and organized labor and artistic ambition. And in doing so, it forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about what came before civilization. Then something happened that changed everything. Not at Göbekli Tepe itself, but in the way we understand the relationship between the people who built it and the civilizations that followed. New discoveries, new technologies, and new ways of reading the evidence began to reveal that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated anomaly. It was part of a much larger, much more complex picture of human activity in the millennia before agriculture. A picture that is still coming into focus, and a picture that contains surprises that the archaeological establishment is only beginning to process. Section 3. The core problem that Göbekli Tepe presents to archaeology is not a problem of evidence. The evidence is there. It has been excavated, documented, photographed, radiocarbon dated, and published in peer-reviewed journals. The problem is a problem of framework. The existing framework for understanding the development of human civilization does not have a place for Göbekli Tepe, and when the evidence does not fit the framework, the scientific community faces a choice: revise the framework or downplay the evidence. The framework in question is the Neolithic Revolution model, first articulated by the Australian-born archaeologist V. Gordon Childe in the 1920s and 30s. Childe proposed that the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, which occurred independently in several parts of the world, beginning around 10,000 before the Common Era, was the most important turning point in human history. Agriculture, in Childe's model, produced surplus food. Surplus food supported specialists who did not farm. Specialists developed crafts, religion, writing, and administration. Administration required cities. Cities required laws. Laws required states. The entire trajectory from farm to civilization followed in Childe's telling, from the simple act of planting seeds. Childe's model was elegant, logical, and enormously influential. It shaped the way generations of archaeologists understood the past. It organized the archaeological record into a comprehensible narrative, and for decades, the evidence seemed to support it. The earliest known cities appeared in regions where agriculture had been established for millennia. The earliest writing appeared in societies with complex agricultural economies. The earliest monumental architecture appeared in societies with centralized states. Everything fit. And then Göbekli Tepe appeared, and nothing fit anymore. The structures at Göbekli Tepe were built by people who did not farm. The botanical evidence from the site shows no domesticated plants. The faunal evidence shows no domesticated animals except possibly the dog. The people who quarried, transported, carved, and erected these massive stone pillars were eating wild game, gathering wild grains, and collecting wild nuts and fruits. They were hunter-gatherers, and they were building monuments that, according to Childe's model, should have been impossible without agriculture. But here is the problem. The evidence does not merely contradict the model, it inverts it. Because the region around Göbekli Tepe is precisely the region where agriculture appears to have originated. The wild ancestors of domesticated wheat, einkorn, and emmer grow naturally in the hills of southeastern Turkey. The genetic evidence, based on DNA analysis of modern and ancient wheat varieties, points to this region as the center of origin for wheat domestication, and the timing of domestication, around 8500 to 8000 before the Common Era, corresponds to the later phases of construction at Göbekli Tepe. The implication is startling. The people who built Göbekli Tepe, or their immediate descendants, were among the first people on Earth to domesticate wheat. And they may have domesticated wheat, not because they needed to feed themselves. They were doing perfectly well as hunter-gatherers in a rich environment, but because they needed to feed the workforce that built and maintained their monuments. The monument came first. Agriculture came second. The need for organized collective labor drove the development of food production, not the other way around. This hypothesis, first articulated by Schmidt himself and subsequently developed by other researchers, remains controversial. Not all archaeologists accept it. Many argue that the relationship between Gobekli Tepe and the origins of agriculture is more complex than a simple cause and effect narrative suggests. But the temporal and geographic correlation between the site and the earliest evidence for wheat domestication is difficult to dismiss. Something was happening in this region during this period that involved both monumental construction and the beginnings of agriculture. Whether one caused the other, or whether both were expressions of some deeper change in human society, is a question that research is still trying to answer. The connection between Gobekli Tepe and the origins of domesticated wheat deserves more detailed examination because it lies at the intersection of two of the most important developments in human history: genetic analysis of modern wheat varieties, conducted by researchers including Manfred Hohn and colleagues at the Agricultural University of Norway, has traced the origin of domesticated einkorn wheat to the Karakadar mountain range, located approximately 30 kilometers from Gobekli Tepe. The genetic evidence suggests that the wild einkorn of this specific area is the closest living relative of all domesticated einkorn wheat, making this small region the probable birthplace of one of humanity's most important crops. The proximity of Gobekli Tepe to the center of wheat domestication cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The two phenomena are linked, though the nature of the link remains debated. The strongest version of the hypothesis proposes that the need to feed the workforce at Gobekli Tepe directly motivated the development of agriculture. The workers who quarried, transported, and carved the pillars needed to eat. If the natural food supply was insufficient for the large gatherings implied by the construction activity, the communities involved may have begun to cultivate wild grains to supplement their diet. Over time, this cultivation would have led to the unintentional selection of traits associated with domestication, such as non-shattering seed heads and larger grains, producing the domesticated einkorn that would eventually become a staple crop across the ancient world. A weaker version of the hypothesis proposes that the causal arrow runs in the opposite direction, or that both developments were responses to a common underlying cause. The end of the Younger Dryas Cold period, with its accompanying changes in rainfall, temperature, and vegetation, may have created conditions that simultaneously favored the construction of gathering places like Gobekli Tepe and the intensification of plant management that led to domestication. Under this interpretation, the monument and the wheat field are siblings, not parent and child, both born from the same period of environmental and social upheaval. Whatever the precise causal relationship, the geographic and temporal correspondence between Gobekli Tepe and the origins of wheat domestication is one of the most significant correlations in the study of human prehistory. It suggests that the development of agriculture was not a separate, independent process occurring in isolation from other aspects of social life. It was embedded in a broader transformation of human society that included monumental construction, artistic expression, and regional social organization. The first farmers were not simple villagers inventing a new way to feed themselves. They were participants in a complex social world that included pilgrimage centers, feasting events, carved stone monuments, and a symbolic system of extraordinary richness. The tools recovered from Gobekli Tepe and its surrounding quarries deserve detailed examination because they represent the technology with which the monuments were built. The primary material was flint, which occurs naturally in the limestone formations of the region. Flint is a form of microcrystalline quartz that fractures conchoidally, meaning it breaks in smooth, curved surfaces that can be controlled by skilled knappers to produce sharp-edged tools. The flint tools found at Gobekli Tepe include large picks for quarrying, smaller blades for carving, and various scrapers and cutting tools for general-purpose work. The picks used for quarrying the limestone are distinctive. They are typically made from large flint nodules, shaped by percussion, flaking into robust, pointed forms that could withstand the impact forces of repeated hammering against limestone. Some picks show evidence of extensive use wear, with their tips rounded and chipped from prolonged contact with the quarry surface. The replacement rate for these tools must have been high. Flint picks working against limestone would have dulled and broken rapidly, requiring a constant supply of replacement tools. The production of these tools, in the quantities required for sustained quarrying, was itself a significant logistical operation. The carving tools are more refined. They include narrow blades and pointed implements that could be used to incise the detailed relief carvings on the pillar surfaces. The carving process appears to have involved two stages. First, the outline of the animal or symbol was incised into the pillar surface using a pointed tool. Then, the surrounding stone was chipped and ground away to create the relief, with the figure standing proud of the background surface. The depth of the relief varies across different carvings, from low relief of just a few millimeters to high relief of several centimeters. The deeper reliefs required the removal of more material and more careful control to avoid damaging the figure itself. The skill required to produce these carvings with stone tools should not be underestimated. Modern stone carvers working with steel chisels and carbide-tipped tools find the production of detailed relief sculpture challenging and time-consuming. Working with stone tools, which are harder to control, more fragile, and less precise than metal tools, the difficulty is substantially greater. Each blow of the flint against the limestone had to be calculated to remove the intended amount of material without cracking the pillar surface or damaging the emerging figure. The carvers needed not just artistic ability, but an intimate understanding of the stone's properties, its grain, its fracture tendency, its response to tools of different shapes and sizes. This was embodied knowledge, the kind that is learned through years of apprenticeship and practice, and it represents one of the earliest documented examples of specialized craft skill in the human record. And it gets stranger. Gobekli Tepe is not the only pre-agricultural monumental site in the region. In the years since Schmidt's initial excavations, a growing number of sites with similar characteristics have been identified across southeastern Turkey and northern Syria. Karahan Tepe, located approximately 35 kilometers from Gobekli Tepe, has revealed a complex of structures with T-shaped pillars, carved reliefs, and elaborately decorated chambers that are comparable in scale and sophistication to those at Gobekli Tepe. Radiocarbon dates from Karahan Tepe suggest that the site is roughly contemporary with the oldest phases of Gobekli Tepe, meaning the two were in use simultaneously. They were not isolated experiments, they were part of a network. Excavations at Karahan Tepe, conducted by a team from Istanbul University, led by Necmi Karul beginning in 2019, have revealed features that go beyond what was found at Gobekli Tepe. One chamber at Karahan Tepe, designated Structure AB, contains a series of carved human figures emerging from the rock wall of the chamber itself, as if the figures are stepping out of the stone. The figures are naturalistic in style, showing detailed human features including faces, ribs, and phalluses. The chamber also contains a carved human head resting on a pillar, surrounded by serpent reliefs. The artistic quality and the iconographic complexity of these carvings suggest a ritual or symbolic function that extended well beyond simple decoration. Other sites in the region have revealed additional evidence of pre-agricultural complexity. Saybursa, a site near the town of the same name in southeastern Turkey, was excavated beginning in 2021 and revealed a communal building with carved stone panels depicting human figures interacting with animals, including leopards and bulls. The scenes appear to tell stories, depicting what may be hunting narratives or mythological events. The site dates to approximately 900 before the Common Era, making it roughly contemporary with Gobekli Tepe. Sifa Tepe, Hamzan Tepe, and several other sites in the region have yielded evidence of monumental construction, T-shaped pillars, or elaborate carved reliefs from the same period. The emerging picture is not of a single site, but of a cultural horizon. A widespread tradition of monumental construction and sophisticated stone carving that extended across southeastern Turkey and possibly beyond during the 10th and 9th millennia before the Common Era, a tradition that was practiced by people who had not yet adopted agriculture, a tradition that implies a level of social organization, artistic achievement, and cultural sophistication that was not supposed to exist at this point in human history. Something is wrong with our assumptions, not with the evidence. The evidence is solid, not with the dating. The dates are confirmed by multiple independent methods. What is wrong is the story we have been telling ourselves about who our ancestors were and what they were capable of. That story, the story of a slow, steady climb from simple to complex, from primitive to civilized, from cave painting to cathedral, is too simple. It does not account for Gobekli Tepe. It does not account for Karahan Tepe. It does not account for Saburs. It does not account for the growing body of evidence that human beings were capable of remarkable things long before the first city was built or the first field was ploughed. The implications of this evidence extend far beyond the specific sites in southeastern Turkey. If a pre-agricultural society in the Fertile Crescent could build Gobekli Tepe, what might pre-agricultural societies in other parts of the world have achieved? How much of what they built has been lost? How much lies buried beneath sediment, jungle, or ocean, waiting to be discovered? The honest answer is that we do not know. We are only beginning to understand the scope of what was possible before agriculture, and we are only beginning to search for the evidence that might reveal it. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. Gobekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Sometime around 8000 before the Common Era, the entire complex was intentionally covered with soil and refuse, filling in the stone circles and concealing the carved pillars beneath several meters of debris. The burial was not the result of natural processes. It was too thorough, too consistent, and too rapid to be explained by gradual accumulation. The people who buried the site did so deliberately. They filled in the structures with thousands of tons of material, creating the distinctive mound that gives the site its modern name. They took a monument that had been maintained and rebuilt for more than a millennium and a half, and chose to hide it from the world. The deliberate burial of Gobekli Tepe is one of the most extraordinary acts in the archaeological record. The site was not abandoned and left to decay. It was actively, deliberately, and thoroughly buried under thousands of cubic meters of soil, rubble, and organic refuse. The fill material has been analyzed and found to contain animal bones, stone tools, and other cultural materials, suggesting that it was not sterile earth brought from elsewhere, but rather accumulated cultural deposit that was shoveled over and into the stone structures to conceal them. The burial preserved the site in extraordinary condition. Carvings that would have been weathered beyond recognition after a few centuries of exposure are still sharp-edged and detailed. Pillars that would have been toppled by earthquakes, quarried for building material, or broken by frost action still stand in their original positions, held in place by the surrounding fill. The burial created an anaerobic environment that protected the stone surfaces from the biological and chemical weathering that destroys most exposed archaeological sites within centuries. The question of why the site was buried has generated extensive speculation. Schmidt himself proposed that the burial was a ritual act, a deliberate closing of the sacred space that may have been associated with a change in the social or religious life of the community. The burial was too thorough, too consistent, and too labor-intensive to be dismissed as natural sedimentation. Someone organized a major effort to bury these structures, an effort that may have involved as much labor as the original construction. An alternative interpretation is that the burial was connected to the transition to agriculture. The final phases of activity at Gobekli Tepe coincide with the earliest evidence for plant domestication in the region. If the monument was associated with the hunter-gatherer way of life, its burial might represent a symbolic break with the past, a physical closing of the chapter of human experience that had produced the great stone circles. The new way of life, based on farming and permanent settlement, may have required a new kind of sacred space, one that was integrated into the daily life of the agricultural community, rather than set apart on a remote hilltop. Whatever the reason, the burial was a gift to the future. Without it, Gobekli Tepe would not exist today. The site would have been destroyed by millennia of weathering, seismic activity, and human reuse. The carved pillars would have been broken up for building material, as has happened to countless ancient monuments across the Near East. The carvings would have been worn smooth by wind and rain. The structural remains would have been reduced to unrecognizable rubble. The deliberate burial that concealed the site also preserved it, creating a time capsule that was sealed more than 10,000 years ago and opened by Schmidt's excavation team in the 1990s. Why? We do not know. Schmidt speculated that the burial may have been a ritual act, a deliberate closure and consecration of the sacred site. Others have proposed that it may have been related to the transition to agriculture, a symbolic ending of the old way of life as the new way took hold. Some have suggested that the site was buried to protect it, to preserve it for a future that the builders could not define but felt was important. Whatever the reason, the burial preserved the site in extraordinary condition. The carvings are sharp, the pillars are intact, the construction details are clearly visible. The burial that hid the site also saved it from the weathering, robbing and reuse that have destroyed most ancient structures over the millennia. Gobekli Tepe survived because it was hidden, and it remained hidden for more than 10,000 years. The relationship between Gobekli Tepe and the surrounding landscape reveals additional layers of complexity. Geophysical surveys of the site, using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry, have revealed that the excavated enclosures represent only a small fraction of the total buried structures. The surveys suggest that as many as 20 major enclosures may be present beneath the surface, along with numerous smaller structures and features. The total area of monumental construction at the site may be several times larger than what has been excavated so far. This has significant implications for our understanding of the effort involved. If 20 major enclosures were built over the 1,500-year period of the site's use, that represents approximately one new enclosure every 75 years, or roughly one per generation. Each enclosure required the quarrying, transport, erection, and carving of a dozen or more major pillars, plus the construction of walls, benches, and floors. Maintaining this rate of construction over 15 centuries required a sustained commitment of labor and resources that is difficult to explain without some form of organized social system. The site was not used continuously. The stratigraphic evidence suggests periods of intensive construction alternating with periods of relative inactivity. The older enclosures of Layer 3 were the largest and most elaborate. The later enclosures of Layer 2 are smaller, with shorter pillars and less elaborate carvings. This pattern of decline mirrors the trajectory of many other monumental building traditions, including the Egyptian pyramids, where the earliest examples are often the most ambitious and the later examples show a reduction in scale and ambition. Whether this decline reflects a loss of organizational capacity, a change in cultural priorities, or simply a shift in the way the site was used is not clear. The archaeological evidence also suggests that the older enclosures were maintained and modified over time. New pillars were added, existing pillars were recarved, floors were replastered, walls were repaired. This pattern of ongoing maintenance implies that the site was not built as a single project and then abandoned. It was a living institution, maintained and renewed across generations. The knowledge required to maintain the site, the skill to repair and modify stone structures, the organizational capacity to mobilize labor for ongoing maintenance had to be transmitted from one generation to the next. This transmission of institutional knowledge across more than a millennium is itself a remarkable achievement. Section 4. Explorations and Tempus. To understand what the people of Gobekli Tepe and their contemporaries were capable of, and what their achievements mean for our understanding of human history, we need to examine several different lines of evidence. Each one reveals a different facet of the pre-agricultural world that the standard narrative has neglected. Together, they paint a picture of a world far more complex, far more capable, and far more interesting than the story we have been telling ourselves. Let us begin with the question of social organization. How did pre-agricultural people organize the labor required to build Gobekli Tepe? The conventional model of hunter-gatherer society assumes small, egalitarian bands of perhaps 25 to 50 people, moving across the landscape in pursuit of food, without permanent leaders, without social hierarchy, and without the capacity for large-scale collective action. This model based primarily on ethnographic observations of modern hunter-gatherer groups, has been the default assumption for reconstructing the social life of prehistoric humans. But the model may not apply to the builders of Gobekli Tepe. The ecological conditions of southeastern Turkey in the 10th millennium before the Common Era were radically different from the marginal environments where most modern hunter-gatherers live. The post-Ice Age landscape was rich, supporting dense populations of game and abundant wild plant foods. Hunter-gatherers in such environments are known, from both ethnographic and archaeological evidence, to be capable of sedentism, meaning they can settle in one place for extended periods without needing to move in search of food. Sedentary hunter-gatherers can accumulate possessions, develop complex social structures, and engage in activities that mobile hunter-gatherers cannot. The Northwest Coast peoples of North America provide a relevant ethnographic parallel. These societies, which were based on fishing rather than farming, developed complex social hierarchies, elaborate artistic traditions, monumental architecture including large plank houses and carved totem poles, and ceremonial systems involving large-scale feasting and gift exchange. They did all of this without agriculture. They did it because their environment was rich enough to support dense, sedentary populations, with sufficient surplus to fund specialists and communal projects. The environment of southeastern Turkey in the 10th millennium may have offered similar conditions. The labor estimates for Gobekli Tepe support this interpretation. If each major pillar required several hundred people to quarry, transport, and erect, and if each enclosure contained a dozen or more pillars, then each enclosure required the mobilized labor of hundreds of people over a period of weeks or months. If multiple enclosures were under construction simultaneously, the total labor force could have numbered in the thousands. Feeding this workforce would have required a systematic approach to food procurement, either through organ hunting and gathering or, as the site's later phases suggest, through the early stages of agriculture. The organizational knowledge required to manage this workforce is itself a significant form of human achievement. Someone had to plan the construction. Someone had to coordinate the quarrying, transport, and erection of the pillars. Someone had to manage the food supply, the tool production, and the allocation of labor. Someone had to maintain quality standards for the carving. Someone had to decide which animals to depict and in what arrangement. All of this implies leadership, planning, and social coordination of a kind that the conventional model of hunter-gatherer society does not accommodate. Now let us consider the artistic tradition. The carvings at Gobekli Tepe and its sister sites are not the earliest known art. Human artistic expression extends back tens of thousands of years to the cave paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet, the carved Venus figurines of the Upper Paleolithic, and the abstract markings found on even older artifacts. But the carvings at Gobekli Tepe represent something different from cave paintings. They are public art, they are architectural art, they are art integrated into constructed spaces that were designed to be entered, experienced, and shared by groups of people. This is a fundamentally different use of art from the private, hidden paintings deep inside cave systems. The iconography of the carvings reveals a complex symbolic world. The animals depicted at Gobekli Tepe are not the animals that the builders ate. Faunal analysis of the bones found at the site shows that the primary food animals were gazelles, aurochs, and wild sheep. But the most commonly depicted animals in the carvings are foxes, snakes, vultures, scorpions, and wild boar, dangerous, threatening, or symbolically charged creatures rather than food species. This pattern suggests that the carvings were not merely decorative. They were symbolic. They represented ideas, stories, or beliefs that were important to the community, but that we cannot fully decode without textual evidence. The math is striking when we consider the scope of the artistic production. More than 60 T-shaped pillars have been uncovered at Gobekli Tepe so far, many bearing multiple animal reliefs and abstract symbols. Geophysical surveys of the unexcavated portions of the site suggest that as many as 20 enclosures may remain buried, containing potentially hundreds of additional pillars. Karahan Tepe has yielded dozens more carved features. The other sites in the region add to the total, The combined artistic output of this cultural tradition represents one of the largest collections of monumental stone art in the world, predating the next comparable tradition by thousands of years. The craft tradition of the Gobekli Tepe builders did not emerge from nothing. It was the product of a long development, most of which is invisible to us. The confident, skilled carvings on the pillars are not the work of beginners. They represent a mature artistic tradition that must have been developing for generations or centuries before the first pillars at Gobekli Tepe were carved. Where was this tradition developing? On what surfaces were the earlier carvings made? On rock faces exposed to weathering? On wooden objects that have long since decayed? On animal skins that returned to the earth millennia ago? We do not know. The artistic tradition that produced the Gobekli Tepe carvings has a visible peak but an invisible beginning. The beginning is lost in the deep time that preceded the site's construction, buried beneath the weight of millennia that erased everything that was not carved in stone. This is the pattern that defines the study of the deep past. Visible peaks and invisible beginnings. Dramatic achievements that appear in the archaeological record to spring from nowhere. The achievement at Gobekli Tepe seems sudden because the development that preceded it left no surviving trace. The stone circles seem to appear without precedent because the precedents were made of materials that did not endure. The artistic skill seems inexplicable because the centuries of practice that developed it are invisible. The iconographic analysis of the Gobekli Tepe carvings has opened windows into the symbolic world of the builders that are simultaneously fascinating and frustrating. The animals depicted on the pillars are not random. Statistical analysis of the species represented shows clear patterns of selection. Certain animals appear far more frequently than others, and the frequencies do not correspond to the animal's prevalence in the local ecology or in the diet of the builders. Foxes, for example, are among the most commonly depicted animals, appearing on multiple pillars across multiple enclosures. But foxes are not common in the faunal assemblage. They were not a significant food source. Their prominence in the art suggests a symbolic or mythological importance that transcended their practical value. Serpents are another frequently depicted animal, appearing in various poses and sizes, sometimes coiling around the edges of pillars or crawling across the surface in relief. Scorpions appear on several pillars, sometimes in contexts that suggest a specific narrative or symbolic function. Vultures, depicted with spread wings and detailed plumage, appear in scenes that some researchers interpret as depicting funerary practices, specifically the exposure of the dead to scavenging birds, a practice known as excarnation or sky burial that is documented in various cultures worldwide. The so-called vulture stone, Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, is one of the most discussed artifacts from the site. The pillar's lower register shows a vulture with outstretched wings, a circular object balanced on one wing, and a headless human figure below. The upper register shows additional animals and abstract symbols. The interpretation of this scene is hotly debated. Some researchers see it as a narrative depicting sky burial. Others interpret the circular object as a representation of the sun or of a human skull. A paper published in 2017 by Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis of the University of Edinburgh proposed that the animals on Pillar 43 represent constellations and that the arrangement encodes an astronomical date corresponding to the Younger Dryas impact event. This interpretation has been controversial, with many archaeologists dismissing it as speculative, but it has drawn attention to the possibility that the carvings encode information about celestial events or astronomical knowledge. The presence of humanoid figures on the T-shaped pillars adds another layer of complexity. The T-shape itself, as noted earlier, has been interpreted as a stylized human form, with the crossbar representing the head and the vertical shaft representing the body. Several pillars bear carved arms and hands on the vertical shaft, with the hands meeting at the front as if folded across the waist. Some pillars show additional details including belts, loincloths, and what appear to be foxskin loincloths or animal pelts worn as garments. If the pillars represent human figures, as seems likely, then the enclosures may represent gatherings of ancestor figures, spirit beings, or mythological personages. The living community that gathered in these spaces would have been surrounded by these stone figures, participating in whatever ritual or social activity the enclosure was designed to host. The symbolic complexity of the site suggests a fully developed mythological system, a coherent body of stories, beliefs, and symbolic associations that gave meaning to the carved images and structured the ritual activities performed at the site. We cannot reconstruct this system in detail because the builders left no written records, but the consistency of the iconography across multiple enclosures and across centuries of use suggests that the system was transmitted from generation to generation with considerable fidelity. This is cultural knowledge of a high order, maintained through oral tradition over more than a millennium. Let us now examine the question of the Younger Dryas, because it provides the environmental context that may explain why Gobekli Tepe was built when it was. The Younger Dryas was a sudden, dramatic return to near-glacial conditions that interrupted the warming trend at the end of the last ice age. It lasted from approximately 10,800 to approximately 9,700 before the Common Era, roughly 1,100 years. During this period, temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped sharply, rainfall patterns shifted, and the ecosystems that had been developing in response to the post-glacial warming were disrupted. The Younger Dryas was caused, according to the prevailing scientific hypothesis, by a disruption of the Atlantic Ocean's thermohaline circulation, the system of deep water currents that transport heat from the tropics to the northern latitudes. The most widely accepted trigger for this disruption is the draining of the glacial Lake Agassiz in North America, which released an enormous volume of fresh water into the North Atlantic, shutting down the thermohaline circulation and plunging the northern hemisphere back into cold conditions. The timing of the Younger Dryas coincides remarkably closely with the construction of Gobekli Tepe. The oldest structures at the site date to the end of the Younger Dryas, or shortly after, around 9500 before the Common Era. Some researchers have proposed that the construction of Gobekli Tepe may have been a response to the Younger Dryas, a collective effort by communities that were under environmental stress to create gathering places, ceremonial centers, or ritual complexes that serve to maintain social cohesion during a period of ecological upheaval. This hypothesis is speculative but not implausible. Periods of environmental stress are known from both historical and archaeological evidence to stimulate social innovation. Societies under pressure often develop new forms of organization, new religious practices, and new communal institutions as ways of coping with the crisis. The Younger Dryas would have placed the hunter-gatherer communities of southeastern Turkey under significant stress, disrupting the animal migrations and plant distributions on which they depended. In response, they may have developed new ways of coming together, new forms of collective action, and new symbolic systems for expressing and maintaining their social bonds. Gobekli Tepe may be the physical expression of that response. The Natufian culture, which flourished in the Levant from approximately 14,500 to approximately 11,500 before the Common Era, provides important context for understanding the social world from which Gobekli Tepe emerged. The Natufians were among the first people in the Near East to establish semi-permanent settlements, building stone-walled houses, grinding wild grains with heavy stone tools, and burying their dead in communal cemeteries. They were sedentary or semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers who exploited the rich resources of the eastern Mediterranean woodlands. The Natufian sites, particularly the larger settlements like Ain Malaha in Israel and Wadi Hami in Jordan, show evidence of social complexity that was previously unexpected in pre-agricultural communities. Some Natufian burials include elaborate grave goods, including shell beadwork, bone tools, and stone pestles, suggesting social differentiation. The communal cemeteries imply a concept of community that extended beyond the individual household, and the heavy investment in stone architecture, including houses with stone foundations, suggests a commitment to place that goes beyond temporary camping. The Natufian culture predates the construction of Gobekli Tepe by approximately 2,000 to 3,000 years. It represents an earlier stage in the process by which Near Eastern societies developed the social complexity that would eventually produce the monumental architecture of the PPNA. The Natufians were not the builders of Gobekli Tepe, but they were part of the same cultural continuum. The social, economic, and symbolic innovations that they developed, sedentary settlement, communal ceremony, artistic expression, elaborated mortuary practice, provided the foundation on which the builders of Gobekli Tepe would erect their stone circles. The transition from the Natufian to the PPNA, the period during which Gobekli Tepe was built, coincided with the Younger Dryas Cold period. The Younger Dryas disrupted the settled lifestyle that the Natufians had developed, forcing many communities to return to a more mobile way of life. But in the resource-rich highlands of southeastern Turkey, where the effects of the Younger Dryas may have been less severe, communities may have been able to maintain their settled lifestyle and even to develop new forms of social complexity in response to the environmental challenges. Gobekli Tepe may represent one of these adaptive responses, a communal gathering place, created by communities under environmental stress, designed to maintain the social bonds that were threatened by changing conditions. Now let us consider the broader landscape of pre-agricultural achievement around the world, because Gobekli Tepe is not the only evidence that pre-farming societies were capable of more than the standard narrative suggests. In the British Isles, the Mesolithic site of Star Kar in Yorkshire, England, dating to approximately 9,300 before the Common Era, has yielded evidence of a semi-permanent settlement with a large wooden platform, evidence of woodworking, antler headdresses that may have served a ritual function, and the earliest known evidence of carpentry in Europe. The site suggests a community that was settled, organized, and engaged in activities that went beyond mere subsistence. In Japan, the Jomon culture, which flourished from approximately 14,000 to 300 before the Common Era, produced some of the oldest known pottery in the world, built settlements with elaborate pit houses, and created a rich artistic tradition, including the famous Dogu figurines, small clay figures with exaggerated eyes and elaborate surface decoration. The Jomon were not farmers, at least not in the early phases of their culture. They were hunter-gatherers and fishers, who, in a rich coastal and forest environment, developed a cultural complexity that rivals many agricultural societies. In North America, the Poverty Point site in Louisiana, dating to approximately 1700 to 1100 before the Common Era, features massive earthworks including concentric ridges and a mound more than 20 meters high. The site was built by a hunter-gatherer society that traded goods across a network spanning much of eastern North America. Like Gobekli Tepe, Poverty Point demonstrates that monumental construction was achievable without agriculture, given the right environmental and social conditions. The architectural innovation at Karahan Tepe deserves extended discussion because it reveals capabilities that go beyond even what was found at Gobekli Tepe. The site, located approximately 35 kilometers southeast of Gobekli Tepe, was surveyed in the 1990s and subjected to systematic excavation beginning in 2019 under the direction of Necmi Karul of Istanbul University. The excavations have revealed a complex of structures that includes T-shaped pillars similar to those at Gobekli Tepe, but also entirely new architectural features that expand our understanding of what pre-agricultural builders could achieve. The most remarkable discovery at Karahan Tepe is Structure AB, a semi-subterranean chamber, carved partly from the bedrock and partly constructed from cut stone blocks. The chamber contains a series of pillar-like forms carved directly from the living rock of the chamber floor, creating an effect in which the figures appear to be rising from the earth itself. The central feature of the chamber is a carved human head, larger than life-size, sitting atop a short pillar and surrounded by reliefs of serpents carved into the surrounding walls. The head is sculpted with naturalistic detail, showing distinct facial features including a nose, mouth, and eye sockets. The overall effect is striking and somewhat unnerving, a human face emerging from the stone in a chamber decorated with coiling serpents. Other areas of Karahan Tepe have revealed additional carvings, including a panel showing a pair of leopards facing each other, carved in a style that is distinct from the Gobekli Tepe tradition, but clearly related to it. The site also contains rock-cut channels and basins that may have been used for water collection or for rituals involving liquids. The overall impression is of a site that was designed as an integrated architectural and sculptural environment, in which the natural rock, the carved figures, the built structures, and possibly water features were combined to create an immersive space for ritual or social use. The discovery of Karahan Tepe confirmed that Gobekli Tepe was not an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a regional tradition of monumental construction that extended across a substantial area of southeastern Turkey. The two sites are close enough geographically that they could have been produced by the same cultural group or by closely related groups sharing a common architectural and artistic tradition. The fact that both sites were in use simultaneously during the 10th and 9th millennia before the Common Era suggests a level of regional cultural coordination that was not previously associated with pre-agricultural societies. Since the beginning of excavations at Karahan Tepe, additional sites in the region have yielded evidence of similar activity. Harbetsuvan Tepe, Gurka Tepe, and several other locations have produced surface finds of T-shaped pillars, carved reliefs, or other features consistent with the Gobekli Tepe tradition. The total number of sites associated with this cultural horizon is still being determined, but it is growing steadily. Each new discovery extends the geographic range of the tradition and deepens the picture of a complex, organized, and artistically sophisticated pre-agricultural society that flourished in southeastern Turkey for more than a millennium before the invention of farming. The site of Bonkuklu Tala in southeastern Turkey, excavated by a team from Mardin Artuklu University beginning in 2012, has added yet another dimension to the pre-agricultural picture. Bonkuklu Tala, located in the Batman province, has yielded evidence of a pre-pottery Neolithic settlement with monumental buildings, communal spaces, and burials containing elaborate grave goods including thousands of stone beads. The site dates to approximately 10,000 to 7,500 before the Common Era, making it broadly contemporary with Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. The discovery of Bonkuklu Tala extended the known range of the pre-pottery Neolithic monumental tradition eastward, demonstrating that it was not confined to the immediate vicinity of Gobekli Tepe, but was spread across a substantial portion of southeastern Turkey. The cumulative weight of these discoveries is transforming our understanding of the pre-pottery Neolithic period. What was once seen as a simple, transitional phase between hunting-gathering and farming is now recognized as a period of extraordinary cultural dynamism. The people of this era were not merely surviving, they were creating, building, organizing, expressing themselves through art and architecture of a quality and scale that would not be matched in the region for thousands of years. They were, in every meaningful sense, the first civilization builders, not because they had cities or writing or metal, but because they had something more fundamental, the will to create something enduring, and the ability to see it through. The Austrian archaeologist Harald Hauptmann, who excavated the important PPNA site of Nevali Chori in the Euphrates Valley before it was flooded by the Ataturk Dam in 1992, was among the first to recognize the significance of the pre-agricultural monumental tradition. Nevali Chori contained T-shaped pillars and carved reliefs similar to those at Gobekli Tepe, though on a smaller scale. The site was contemporary with the early phases of Gobekli Tepe and provided the first evidence that monumental construction in the PPNA was not confined to a single site. The tragic flooding of Nevali Chori by the dam reservoir is itself a reminder of how easily archaeological evidence can be lost, even in the modern era. The site is now inaccessible, its monuments submerged beneath the waters of the reservoir. The artifacts that were recovered before the flooding are preserved in museums. But the site itself, with its spatial relationships, its stratigraphic sequences, and its contextual information, is gone forever. There is one more parallel that deserves mention. The Aboriginal Australians maintained a continuous cultural tradition for an estimated 65,000 years, the longest documented cultural continuity in human history. Their songlines, a complex system of oral narratives encoding geographic, spiritual, and practical information, allowed them to navigate across vast distances without maps or written records. Their rock art, found across the continent, spans tens of thousands of years and includes both ancient traditions and continuing practices. The Aboriginal example demonstrates that extraordinary cultural achievement does not require agriculture, cities, or writing. It requires only what human beings carry within themselves: memory, creativity, and the determination to transmit what matters from one generation to the next. These examples, spread across different continents and different millennia, collectively challenge the assumption that complexity requires agriculture. They suggest that the human capacity for organization, artistic expression, and monumental construction is not a product of farming. It is a product of humanity itself. It emerges wherever conditions allow, whether those conditions involve agriculture or not. The standard narrative of human development, with its neat progression from hunting to farming to cities, is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. It captures one trajectory of human development while ignoring others, and the trajectories it ignores are precisely the ones that Gobekli Tepe and its contemporaries force us to confront. The question of why Gobekli Tepe was not a residential settlement is itself significant. Extensive excavation has revealed no evidence of permanent habitation at the site. No houses, no hearths for cooking, no storage facilities for food, no domestic refuse of the kind that accumulates at inhabited sites. The buildings at Gobekli Tepe were not homes. They were something else: gathering places, ritual venues, ceremonial centers. Whatever we call them, they were spaces designed for communal use rather than individual habitation. This distinction between residential and non-residential architecture is important because it implies a degree of social organization that goes beyond the household level. The builders of Gobekli Tepe did not live at the site. They came from elsewhere. They traveled to the hilltop, participated in whatever activities the enclosures were designed for, and then returned to their homes, which may have been scattered across a wide area. This pattern of pilgrimage, of traveling to a central sacred site from dispersed residential locations, is well documented in many later societies. But to find it operating in a pre-agricultural context more than 11,000 years ago is surprising. It implies a territorial organization, a concept of a shared sacred landscape, and a system of communication and coordination that links multiple communities across a region. The absence of residential architecture at Gobekli Tepe also has implications for the labor organization. The workers who built and maintained the site had to be fed, and if they did not live at the site, the food had to be brought in from elsewhere. This requires either the storage and transport of preserved foods or the organization of hunting and gathering expeditions in the vicinity of the site. The large quantities of animal bone found at the site suggest that the latter option was important. Organized hunts, conducted in the rich hunting grounds surrounding Gobekli Tepe, may have provided the meat that fueled the construction and ritual activities. The concept of a non-residential ceremonial center, used by multiple communities from a wide catchment area, challenges the assumption that pre-agricultural societies were organized at the level of the individual band. The builders of Gobekli Tepe operated at a regional level, coordinating the activities of multiple communities toward a shared goal. This level of coordination implies leadership, communication, and a shared cultural identity that transcended the boundaries of individual bands. It implies, in other words, something that looks very much like a society, not a state, not a kingdom, but a society nonetheless. A web of relationships, obligations, and shared beliefs that bound people together across distances and across generations. The site of Çatalhöyük in central Turkey provides another important data point in the pre-Egyptian landscape. Excavated originally by James Mellart in the 1960s, and subsequently by Ian Hodder of Stanford University, beginning in 1993, Çatalhöyük is one of the oldest known proto-urban settlements in the world. It dates to approximately 7500 to 5700 before the Common Era, making it roughly contemporary with the later phases of activity at Gobekli Tepe and the early phases of the PPNB. Çatalhöyük was a dense settlement of mud brick houses, built wall-to-wall with no streets, accessed through holes in the roofs. The population at its peak may have reached between 5,000 and 8,000 people. The houses were decorated with elaborate wall paintings, including scenes of hunting, geometric patterns, and images of vultures and other animals. Some houses contained installations that appear to have served ritual functions, including platforms beneath which the dead were buried, and walls decorated with modelled plaster reliefs of animals. The relationship between Çatalhöyük and the Gobekli Tepe tradition is a subject of active research. The two sites are separated by roughly 2,000 years and by several hundred kilometres. They share some iconographic elements, particularly the prominent role of vultures, bulls, and other animals in their art. But they represent different types of settlement. Gobekli Tepe was a non-residential ritual complex, a place that people visited but did not live in. Çatalhöyük was a residential settlement, where ritual activity was integrated into the domestic space of ordinary houses. The transition from the communal, non-residential ritual of Gobekli Tepe to the domestic, household-based ritual of Çatalhöyük may represent a fundamental change in the way communities organized their religious and social lives during the early Neolithic. Çatalhöyük also provides evidence that the artistic traditions of the pre-agricultural period did not simply disappear when agriculture was adopted. They evolved. They were adapted to new contexts. The wall paintings of Çatalhöyük are not identical to the pillar carvings of Gobekli Tepe, but they share a concern with animal imagery, with the relationship between humans and the natural world, and with the representation of powerful, dangerous creatures. The thread of artistic and symbolic continuity that connects the two sites across 2,000 years of cultural change suggests that the people of Çatalhöyük inherited, in modified form, the cultural traditions that had been developed at Gobekli Tepe and its contemporaries. The question of belief systems and religious thought at Gobekli Tepe touches on some of the most fundamental questions in the study of human cognition. What did these people believe? What were the pillars meant to represent? What stories were told in the enclosures? What rituals were performed? The answers to these questions are largely beyond our reach. Without written records, we cannot reconstruct the belief system of the builders with any confidence. We can describe the symbols, we can identify the animals, we can note the patterns and the repetitions, but we cannot read the meaning. What we can say is that the investment of labour and resources in the construction of Gobekli Tepe implies that the activities performed at the site were considered of profound importance by the builders. People do not quarry, transport, carve, and erect 10 metric ton stone pillars for trivial purposes. The construction of each enclosure represented a commitment of hundreds or thousands of person-hours of labour. The maintenance of the site over more than 15 centuries required a sustained organisational effort that must have been motivated by deeply held beliefs about the importance of the place and the activities associated with it. The animal symbolism offers some clues. The predominance of dangerous or predatory animals, foxes, serpents, scorpions, vultures, wild boar, suggests that the symbolic world of the builders was organised around themes of danger, death, and the wild. These are not the animals of the domesticated landscape. They are the animals of the untamed world, the world beyond the boundary of human control. Their depiction in a monumental context may represent an attempt to engage with, to control, or to honour the forces of the wild that dominated the pre-agricultural world. The human-like form of the T-shaped pillars suggests that the enclosures may have represented gatherings of supernatural beings, ancestors, or spirits. If the pillars represent human figures, then the people who entered the enclosures were entering a space populated by non-human or superhuman presences. This is consistent with the ritual architecture of many later cultures, in which temples and sanctuaries are conceived as the dwelling places of gods or spirits, spaces where the boundary between the human and the divine is thin. The arms and hands carved on some of the central pillars, reaching toward the front as if folded in a gesture of repose or presentation, suggest that the figures were not merely standing, they were doing something, waiting, watching, presiding. The gesture is one of authority and stillness, the posture of a figure that occupies a space by right and will not be moved. Whatever these figures represented to the people who carved them, they were important enough to be carved in stone, erected in the center of carefully constructed enclosures, and maintained for more than a millennium. They were the enduring presence at the heart of a place that mattered more to the builders than any dwelling, any tool, any other product of their hands. The relationship between the pre-pottery Neolithic cultures of the Near East and the later civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt is a subject of ongoing research and debate. The gap between the end of the Gobekli Tepe tradition, around 8,000 before the Common Era, and the emergence of the first Mesopotamian cities, around 3,500 before the Common Era, is approximately 4,500 years. This is an enormous span of time, longer than the entire history of ancient Egypt. What happened during this interval? What connection, if any, exists between the people who built Gobekli Tepe and the people who built and Uruk? The honest answer is that the connection is unclear. The 4,500-year gap is filled with a complex sequence of cultural developments, including the spread of agriculture, the invention of pottery, the development of metallurgy, and the gradual emergence of the social and economic structures that would eventually produce urban civilization. Some elements of the Gobekli Tepe tradition may have persisted in modified form through the intervening millennia. The T-shaped pillar form, for example, has been compared to the standing stones found at later Neolithic and Chalcolithic sites in the region. The emphasis on animal symbolism in art and architecture persists throughout the Near Eastern tradition, from the earliest cave paintings through the monumental reliefs of Assyria. But direct continuity between Gobekli Tepe and the later civilizations has not been established. What can be said is that the region where Gobekli Tepe was built is also the region where agriculture originated, where the first permanent settlements emerged, and where many of the key innovations of the Neolithic period were developed. The people who built Gobekli Tepe were the ancestors, biologically and culturally, of the people who would eventually develop the technologies and institutions of civilization. Their achievements at Gobekli Tepe were not a dead end, they were a beginning. The social complexity, the organizational capacity, and the symbolic richness that the site displays were the raw materials from which civilization would eventually be assembled, not in a straight line, not in a simple progression, but through a complex, multi-millennial process of development, adaptation, and transformation that eventually produced the urban civilizations of the Bronze Age. Let us return to Gobekli Tepe itself, because recent discoveries at the site have complicated the picture further. In 2021, researchers from the German Archaeological Institute published an analysis of the geometric layout of several enclosures at Gobekli Tepe. They found that the three central pillars and the enclosure walls of the major structures were arranged according to a common geometric plan, with the central pillars forming the vertices of near equilateral triangles. The distances between the central pillars of different enclosures were consistent with a standardized unit of measurement, suggesting that the builders used a planned layout rather than an ad hoc arrangement. The analysis also found that the enclosures were oriented with respect to each other, with sight lines connecting the central pillars of different structures. This finding has significant implications. If the enclosures were laid out according to a common plan, the builders possessed knowledge of geometry and measurement that was not previously attributed to pre-agricultural societies. They were not simply piling stones. They were designing spaces according to principles of proportion and alignment. They were using a unit of measurement, which implies the existence of a measuring tool, a standardized length, and the social agreement to use it consistently. These are the hallmarks of organized construction, the same hallmarks that characterize the planned cities of the Indus Valley and the aligned monuments of ancient Egypt, but appearing thousands of years earlier than any previously known example. Section 5. The deeper truth. The deeper truth about the civilization before the Egyptians is not about Gobekli Tepe specifically. It is about what Gobekli Tepe represents, and what it represents is a gap, an enormous, yawning gap in our knowledge of the human past, a gap that we have been filling with assumptions, and those assumptions have been wrong. For most of the history of archaeology, the period before agriculture has been treated as a prelude, a warm-up act before the main show. The tens of thousands of years during which human beings lived as hunter-gatherers were condensed into a few paragraphs in the textbooks, characterized as a period of simplicity, stasis, and survival. The interesting part of human history, in this telling, began around 10,000 years ago when people started farming. Everything before that was just waiting. Gobekli Tepe reveals the absurdity of this assumption. Human beings have been anatomically modern for at least 300,000 years. They have been behaviorally modern, producing art, using symbolic thought, and developing complex social structures for at least 50,000 years. The period between the emergence of behavioral modernity and the beginning of agriculture is roughly 40,000 years. 40,000 years. That is 8 times the entire span of recorded history. 8 times the distance from the first pharaoh to the present day, and we have treated this vast expanse of human experience as a blank, a void, a period of nothingness before the story began. Let that sink in. 40,000 years of human history, during which our ancestors were just as intelligent, just as creative, just as socially complex as we are, reduced to a footnote. The assumption that nothing of significance happened during this period is not based on evidence. It is based on the absence of evidence. And the absence of evidence, as the old maxim goes, is not evidence of absence. Consider what might have been built during those 40,000 years. Consider what might have been created, organized, celebrated, and lost. Consider the artistic traditions that might have flourished and died, the social experiments that might have been tried and abandoned, the architectural achievements that might have risen and fallen, leaving no trace that we have yet found. The human beings who lived during this period were our equals in every cognitive capacity. They had the same brains, the same hands, the same creative impulse. The only thing they lacked, relative to later civilizations, was the specific technologies of agriculture, metallurgy, and writing. And as Gobekli Tepe demonstrates, the absence of those technologies did not prevent them from achieving things that we would have considered impossible. This is not science fiction. This is a logical inference from the known evidence. If pre-agricultural people in southeastern Turkey could build Gobekli Tepe in 9500 before the Common Era, what might pre-agricultural people have built in 20,000 before the Common Era? In 30,000? In 40,000? We do not know. We may never know. The archaeological record of the deep past is fragmentary, biased toward durable materials, and concentrated in the few regions where conditions favor preservation. Most of what was built from wood, woven fiber, animal skin, and other perishable materials is gone. Most of what was built along coastlines that have since been submerged by rising sea levels is underwater. Most of what was built in tropical environments, where organic decay is rapid, has returned to the earth. The material record of the deep past is a tiny, biased sample of what actually existed. And the sample we have, fragmentary as it is, includes Gobekli Tepe. Let that sink in. If the tiny fraction of the past that we can see includes something as extraordinary as Gobekli Tepe, what does the vast fraction we cannot see contain? There is a concept in cognitive science called the availability heuristic. It describes the human tendency to judge the frequency or importance of events based on how easily examples come to mind. Events that are dramatic, recent, or widely reported seem more frequent and more important than events that are obscure, distant, or poorly documented. The availability heuristic shapes not just individual thinking, but collective understanding. It determines which events enter the cultural narrative and which are excluded. The availability heuristic helps explain why Gobekli Tepe remains relatively unknown. The site is old, which makes it distant from common experience. It was built by people who left no written records, which makes it difficult to construct a narrative around specific individuals or events. It does not contain gold, treasure, or dramatic artifacts that would make for compelling museum exhibits. It does not have the visual impact of the pyramids or the romantic appeal of a lost city in the jungle. It is, in popular terms, hard to sell, and in a culture that consumes its history primarily through visual media, a site that consists of carved stone pillars buried in a hillside is at a disadvantage compared to a site that consists of golden death masks and colossal statues. But the importance of a discovery is not proportional to its visual appeal. Gobekli Tepe, may be the most important archaeological site discovered in the past century. It fundamentally challenges the foundational narrative of how human civilization developed. It demonstrates capabilities that were not supposed to exist at the time it was built. It opens a window into a period of human history that was previously opaque, and it raises questions about what other evidence of pre-agricultural complexity might be waiting to be discovered. The site also raises uncomfortable questions about the way archaeological knowledge is produced and disseminated. The excavation of Gobekli Tepe has been funded primarily by the German Archaeological Institute, with support from Turkish institutions. The publication of the findings has been steady but technical, appearing primarily in academic journals and specialized monographs. The broader public has been reached mainly through a relatively small number of popular science articles, documentaries, and books. The result is that Gobekli Tepe is well known among specialists but poorly known among the general public. The civilization before the Egyptians remains, for most people, the civilization we do not talk about. The educational establishment has been slow to incorporate the implications of Gobekli Tepe into its curricula. Most history textbooks still begin the story of civilization with the Neolithic Revolution and the first agricultural settlements. Gobekli Tepe, if it appears at all, is mentioned as an interesting anomaly, rather than as a fundamental challenge to the established narrative. The textbooks have not been rewritten. The paradigm has not been formally revised. The old story persists, not because the evidence supports it, but because paradigm change is slow, difficult, and institutionally disruptive. The implications for the origins of civilization are profound. The Standard Model treats civilization as an invention, something that was developed at a specific time and place, and then spread outward from its point of origin. The Neolithic Revolution, in this model, was the founding event, the moment when everything changed. But Gobekli Tepe suggests that the capacity for civilization, the organizational, artistic, and intellectual capability that makes complex societies possible, existed long before the Neolithic Revolution. It was not created by agriculture. It was present in human communities that had never planted a seed. Agriculture did not create civilization. It created the conditions under which civilization could become permanent, visible, and transmissible. But the capacity itself, the human capacity for collective achievement, was already there. This is a subtle but important distinction. It shifts our understanding of what civilization is. It is not a stage of development that humanity reached at a specific point in time. It is a potential that exists in every human community, realized to different degrees under different conditions. Some communities realized it without agriculture, as the builders of Gobekli Tepe did, and some realized it with agriculture, as the Egyptians and Mesopotamians did. And some communities may have realized it in ways that left no surviving trace, in materials that did not endure, in environments that did not preserve. The deeper truth is that we are not the first civilization. We may not even be the 100th. We are simply the most recent, in a long, largely undocumented succession of human achievements that stretches back into a past so deep that it makes recorded history look like a footnote. And the people who built Gobekli Tepe, the people we do not talk about, the people who predated Egypt by more than 6 millennia, are not the beginning of this story. They are simply the oldest chapter that we have been able to read. The earlier chapters, if they exist, are written in materials that time has erased. The concept of deep time is essential to grasping the significance of Gobekli Tepe and what it implies about human history. Deep time, a term coined by the author John McPhee in his writing about geology, refers to the vast spans of time that precede recorded history. In geological terms, deep time extends back billions of years. In human terms, it extends back hundreds of thousands of years, to the emergence of our species in Africa and the subsequent dispersal of human populations across the globe. Most people have a very limited ability to comprehend deep time. We can understand centuries. We can stretch our imaginations to encompass millennia, but tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, these spans are simply too large for the human mind to hold. We flatten them. We compress them. We treat them as background noise. a featureless expanse between the emergence of our species and the beginning of the interesting part. But the interesting part has always been happening. For the entire span of human existence, human beings have been thinking, creating, organizing, and building. The cave paintings of Chauvet, dating to approximately 36,000 years ago, show artistic sophistication that rivals anything produced in later periods. The shell beads found at Blombos Cave in South Africa, dating to approximately 75,000 years ago, show symbolic thinking and aesthetic sensibility that is fully modern. The ochre processing at the same site shows systematic behavior, the methodical preparation of materials for a specific purpose. That implies planning, forethought, and the kind of practical knowledge that is developed through sustained practice. These data points, scattered across tens of thousands of years, are the visible tips of an enormous submerged iceberg. They represent the tiny fraction of human activity that happened to be preserved in the archaeological record. Below the waterline, invisible to us, are the vast majority of the creative, social, and organizational activities that human beings engaged in during these periods. The songs that were sung, the stories that were told, the social structures that were developed and maintained, the practical techniques that were invented and refined, the conflicts that were resolved, the communities that were built. None of this is preserved in the archaeological record because it was expressed in perishable media: voice, gesture, wood, fiber, and the intangible medium of human relationship. Gobekli Tepe is a rare moment when the iceberg breaks the surface, a moment when the achievements of deep-time humanity, usually invisible to us, become visible in durable stone. And the lesson of this moment is not that Gobekli Tepe was unique. The lesson is that it was representative, that the people who built it were not exceptional outliers. They were ordinary human beings, living in an extraordinary time, doing what human beings have always done: creating, organizing, building, leaving their mark. The difference is that their mark survived, and ours, in most cases, has not. The fragility of the archaeological record is itself a form of lost knowledge. Every site that has been destroyed by erosion, by rising sea levels, by tectonic activity, by the construction of modern cities on top of ancient ones, represents knowledge that is gone forever. We cannot study what we cannot find. We cannot understand what has been destroyed. And the uncomfortable truth is that the vast majority of what human beings have built, created, and achieved over the past 50,000 years has been destroyed. Not by enemies, not by catastrophe, by time, by the relentless, patient, indifferent processes of natural decay and geological change that reduce everything, eventually, to dust. The question of what might lie beneath the world's oceans is particularly provocative in the context of pre-agricultural civilization. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. The coastlines of the world were dramatically different. The English Channel was dry land. Australia was connected to New Guinea. Japan was connected to the Asian mainland. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The Sunda Shelf of Southeast Asia, now submerged beneath the South China Sea, was an enormous landmass the size of a continent. These now submerged landscapes were, during the period when Gobekli Tepe was built, dry land. They were habitable. People lived on them. Hunter-gatherer communities occupied the coastal zones, the river valleys, and the plains that are now beneath the sea. If these communities were capable of building structures, creating art, or organizing complex societies, the evidence would now be underwater. And underwater evidence is extraordinarily difficult to find, study, and preserve. The rising sea levels that followed the end of the Ice Age did not rise uniformly. They rose in pulses, periods of rapid rise separated by periods of relative stability. The most dramatic of these pulses, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around approximately 14,600 years ago and raised sea levels by approximately 20 meters in less than 500 years. This rate of rise, approximately 4 centimeters per year, would have been visible within a human lifetime. Coastal communities would have watched the sea advance, year by year, swallowing the land they had known. The displacement of these communities, the loss of their settlements, and the submergence of their monuments, if any existed, would have been a slow-motion catastrophe unfolding over centuries. The possibility that pre-agricultural coastal civilizations existed and were destroyed by rising sea levels is speculative. There is no direct evidence for it, precisely because any evidence would be underwater and difficult to access. But the possibility cannot be dismissed. The human communities that lived along the Ice Age coastlines had the same cognitive capabilities as the people who built Gobekli Tepe. They lived in environments that were often rich and productive, supporting dense populations of fish, shellfish, and marine mammals. They had every reason to develop the same kinds of social complexity, artistic expression, and architectural ambition that the people of southeastern Turkey demonstrated. Whether they did so, and whether any evidence of their achievements survives beneath the waves, is a question that marine archaeology is only beginning to explore. The underwater sites that have been investigated so far, while not as dramatic as Göbekli Tepe, hint at what might be found. The site of Atlit Yam, off the coast of Israel, is a submerged PPNB village dating to approximately 7000 before the Common Era. The site preserves a stone semicircle that may have served a ritual function, along with houses, wells, and human burials. The stone semicircle at Atlit Yam, while modest compared to the enclosures of Göbekli Tepe, demonstrates that pre-agricultural and early agricultural communities did build stone structures in coastal areas that are now submerged. The site of Pavlopetri, off the southern coast of Greece, is a submerged Bronze Age city, dating to approximately 3000 before the Common Era. While much later than the period we are discussing, Pavlopetri demonstrates that complete urban settlements can be preserved underwater in remarkable condition, with streets, buildings, and artifacts still in their original positions. If Bronze Age cities can survive under the sea, then earlier structures, built during the period of lower sea levels, might also survive. The technology for finding and excavating underwater archaeological sites is advancing rapidly. Side-scan sonar, autonomous underwater vehicles, photogrammetry, and high-resolution bathymetric mapping are making it possible to survey large areas of the seafloor with unprecedented detail. The next great archaeological discovery of the pre-agricultural world may come not from a hilltop in Turkey, but from the bottom of the sea. Göbekli Tepe survived because it was deliberately buried. That burial, whatever its purpose, preserved the site in conditions that natural decay would have destroyed long ago. If Göbekli Tepe had been left exposed, like most ancient structures, the limestone pillars would have eroded, the carvings would have weathered away, and the entire complex would have been reduced to an unrecognizable scatter of broken rock. We would never have known it existed. And we would have continued to tell ourselves the comfortable story that nothing of significance happened before agriculture. The emotional weight of the Göbekli Tepe discovery is something that scholars rarely discuss in their published work, but that anyone who has visited the site will attest to. There is a feeling that comes from standing among the carved pillars, surrounded by images that were carved more than 100 centuries ago, a feeling of connection, of recognition. The animals carved on these stones are not abstractions. They are vivid, lively, individual. The fox turns its head, the boar bristles, the crane stretches its neck. These images were created by people who observed the natural world with the same attention, the same curiosity, the same pleasure in detail that we bring to our own observations. They saw what we see, they felt what we feel. They wanted what we want, to capture something fleeting and make it permanent. And they succeeded. Their carvings have outlasted everything. The carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe are, in a very real sense, the oldest surviving works of monumental art on Earth. They are the earliest examples of human artistic expression on an architectural scale, integrated into constructed spaces designed for communal use. Cave paintings are older, portable figurines are older, but carved stone reliefs on architectural pillars, standing within carefully designed enclosures, this begins at Göbekli Tepe. Everything that followed, the reliefs of Egyptian temples, the friezes of Greek temples, the sculptural programs of medieval cathedrals, all are descendants, in a broad cultural sense, of the tradition that produced these carvings. The human desire to adorn constructed spaces with meaningful images is one of the most fundamental expressions of our species, and it begins here, in the hills of southeastern Turkey 11,600 years ago. How many other Gobekli Tepes have there been? How many monuments, temples, gathering places, or ceremonial complexes have been built, used, and destroyed without leaving a trace? How many human achievements, born of the same creativity and ambition that produced the carved pillars of southeastern Turkey, have been erased by the passage of 10,000, 20,000, 40,000 years? These are not rhetorical questions, they are empirical questions, and the honest answer to every one of them is the same: we do not know. Section 6. Implications and Reflection. What does it mean that there were civilizations, or proto-civilizations, before Egypt? What does it say about the story we have been telling ourselves about human progress? And what does it ask of us, the people who inhabit the most recent and most visible chapter of the human story? It means, first, that the story is longer than we thought, much longer. The textbooks begin with Sumer and Egypt, with the first cities and the first writing around 3000 to 3100 before the Common Era. But the human story of collective achievement, of organized labor, of artistic expression, of monumental ambition, begins at least 7,000 years earlier. The story we tell in the textbooks is the last act of a much longer play, and we have been mistaking the last act for the whole performance. It means, second, that the capacity for civilization is not the product of agriculture or any other specific technology. It is a human capacity. It exists wherever human beings exist. It can be expressed with stone tools and without pottery. It can be expressed without writing, without metal, without the wheel. It requires only what human beings bring with them wherever they go: intelligence, creativity, social cooperation, and the desire to build something that transcends the individual lifespan. These qualities are not the products of the Neolithic revolution. They are the products of being human. It means, third, that the archaeological record is not a complete inventory of human achievement. It is a fragmentary, biased, and deeply incomplete sample. The sites we have found represent a tiny fraction of the sites that once existed. The artifacts we have recovered represent a tiny fraction of the objects that were once made. The cultures we can identify represent a tiny fraction of the cultures that once flourished. For every Gobekli Tepe that survived, how many were lost? For every carved pillar that we can study, how many were carved from wood or bone and have long since decayed? For every stone circle that we can map, how many circles of wooden posts or woven screens have returned to the earth without a trace? The implications for how we understand ourselves are perhaps the most important and the least discussed. If the capacity for civilization predates agriculture, then civilization is not a technological achievement. It is a human achievement. It is something that human beings do, naturally, whenever conditions allow. The conditions may include agriculture. They may include a rich natural environment that supports dense populations without farming. They may include seasonal abundance that provides surplus without cultivation. They may include social structures, kinship systems, or ritual practices that mobilize collective labor without centralized authority. The specific conditions vary. The underlying capacity is constant. This understanding has implications for how we think about the future as well as the past. If civilization is not dependent on any specific technology, then it is not threatened by the loss of any specific technology. It is resilient, it is adaptable, it is capable of emerging in new forms under new conditions. The loss of fossil fuels, the disruption of digital networks, the failure of global supply chains, none of these would eliminate the human capacity for collective achievement. They would change the conditions under which that capacity is expressed. But the capacity itself, the same capacity that produced Gobekli Tepe with nothing more than stone tools and human hands, would endure. There is also a moral dimension to the rediscovery of the civilization before the Egyptians. For centuries, the story of human history has been told as a story of progress, from primitive to advanced, from simple to complex, from savage to civilized. This story has been used, explicitly and implicitly, to justify the domination of some peoples by others. Peoples who were perceived as primitive, who had not developed agriculture or cities or writing, were deemed inferior, their lands available for conquest, their cultures available for erasure. The story of progress was not merely an academic narrative, it was a political weapon. Gobekli Tepe undermines this weapon. It shows that people without agriculture were capable of monumental achievement. It shows that complexity does not require the specific technologies that the Western tradition has identified as markers of civilization. It shows that the human capacity for greatness is universal, not the property of any particular culture, technology, or historical period. The builders of Gobekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. They were also architects, artists, organizers, and visionaries. They were everything that the narrative of progress says they should not have been, and they were real. The philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn described the process by which scientific paradigms change. A paradigm, in Kuhn's terms, is a framework of assumptions and methods that defines normal science. Paradigms do not change easily. They resist change because they organize the work of thousands of researchers, define the questions that are considered important, and determine what counts as an acceptable answer. When evidence appears that contradicts the paradigm, the first response is not to abandon the paradigm, but to adjust it, to find ways of accommodating the anomalous evidence without fundamentally revising the framework. Gobekli Tepe is a paradigm-challenging anomaly. It contradicts the Neolithic Revolution model at its most fundamental level, the assumption that agriculture precedes complexity. The archaeological community has responded in the way that Kuhn would predict. The evidence has been acknowledged, the dates have been accepted, the importance of the site has been recognized, but the paradigm has not been fully revised. The textbooks still tell the old story, with Gobekli Tepe added as an interesting footnote. The framework still assumes that agriculture drives complexity, with Gobekli Tepe treated as an exception rather than a refutation. This is beginning to change. A younger generation of archaeologists, less invested in the old framework and more willing to follow the evidence, is developing new models that accommodate the pre-agricultural complexity revealed by Gobekli Tepe and its contemporaries. But the process is slow. Paradigm shifts always are, and in the meantime, the civilization before the Egyptians remains. For most people, the civilization we do not talk about. There is a particular irony in the way the story of human civilization has been told that Gobekli Tepe makes visible. The textbooks devote chapters to the civilizations that left written records. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, China, India. These civilizations are well documented because they could document themselves. They had writing, they had scribes. They had the ability to record their histories, their laws, their myths, and their achievements in durable media. The civilizations that did not have writing are, by definition, poorly documented. Their achievements must be reconstructed from physical evidence alone, without the benefit of textual interpretation. This creates a systematic bias in the historical record. Civilizations with writing are overrepresented. Civilizations without writing are underrepresented. The textbook history of the world is, in effect, a history of literacy. It tells the story of the people who could write, at the expense of the people who could not. The people who built Gobekli Tepe could not write, and so, for more than 10,000 years, their story went untold, not because it was unimportant, not because their achievement was insignificant, but because they could not tell it themselves, and no one else was paying attention. The bias toward literate civilizations has a corollary. It creates a false impression of a sharp boundary between prehistory and history, between the time before writing and the time after. This boundary, which is a convenient organizational device for textbooks, has been mistaken for a real divide in human capability. Before writing, people were supposedly primitive. After writing, they were civilized. Gobekli Tepe demolishes this distinction. It demonstrates that human beings were capable of monumental achievement thousands of years before the invention of writing. The boundary between prehistory and history is not a boundary between simplicity and complexity. It is a boundary between silence and speech. Before writing, people were just as complex. They were simply silent. Their achievements were real, but unrecorded. And because they were unrecorded, they have been dismissed, overlooked, and forgotten. The correction of this bias is one of the most important tasks facing modern archaeology. The expansion of archaeological investigation into the pre-literate past, using the full range of modern scientific techniques, is revealing a world of human achievement that was previously invisible. Gobekli Tepe is the most dramatic example, but it is not the only one. New discoveries are being made every year, each one extending the timeline of human complexity further into the past. The story is being rewritten, but the rewriting is slow, and the old story, the comfortable story of a steady climb from primitive to civilized, is deeply embedded in the public consciousness. Changing it will require not just new evidence, but a new way of thinking about what evidence means. There is a pause that is necessary here, a moment to consider what it means that an entire chapter of human achievement, perhaps the most important chapter, has been hidden from us. Not by conspiracy, not by suppression, by the ordinary processes of scholarly conservatism, educational inertia, and the simple difficulty of revising a story that has been told the same way for nearly a century. The people who built Gobekli Tepe were real. Their achievement was extraordinary. Their contribution to the human story is incalculable, and they have been treated, by the mainstream narrative, as an afterthought. This matters because the stories we tell about the past shape our understanding of the present. If we tell ourselves that civilization began with farming, we are saying that complexity is a product of technology. If we tell ourselves that human beings were simple and primitive before agriculture, we are saying that our potential is limited by our tools. But if Gobekli Tepe tells us anything, it tells us the opposite. That human potential is not limited by technology. That complexity is not a product of agriculture. That the capacity for greatness is as old as humanity itself. And that the story of human achievement is not a short climb from savagery to civilization, but a long, deep, rich tapestry of creation and loss, of building and forgetting, of achievement and silence, stretching back further than we can see and containing more than we can imagine. There is a question that Gobekli Tepe poses to every person who encounters it, whether in person or through photographs and descriptions. The question is this: what else have we missed? If a monument of this scale and sophistication could remain unknown for more than 10,000 years, buried under a hillside in a region that has been inhabited continuously since the site was sealed, what other discoveries are waiting? The archaeological survey of the planet is far from complete. Vast areas have never been systematically surveyed. Entire regions, particularly in tropical environments where organic preservation is poor, have yielded almost no evidence of pre-agricultural activity, not because the activity did not occur, but because the evidence has not survived or has not been found. The development of remote sensing technologies, including satellite imagery, LiDAR, and ground-penetrating radar, is beginning to change this situation. LiDAR surveys in Central America have revealed extensive Maya settlement systems that were invisible beneath the jungle canopy. Similar surveys in Southeast Asia have revealed the full extent of the Angkor water management network. The application of these technologies to the Near East and to other regions with potential for pre-agricultural sites could yield discoveries that match or exceed Gobekli Tepe in significance. The pace of discovery is accelerating. In the decade since Schmidt's death in 2014, more has been learned about the pre-pottery Neolithic of southeastern Turkey than in the previous century. Karahan Tepe, Saybursh, and other sites have expanded the geographic and cultural range of the monumental tradition that Gobekli Tepe represents. New analytical techniques, including ancient DNA analysis, isotope chemistry, and high-resolution dating methods, are providing insights into the population dynamics, dietary patterns, and mobility of the builders that were previously inaccessible. The civilization before the Egyptians is not a closed chapter, it is an opening chapter, one that is being written now in real time as new discoveries reshape our understanding of what human beings were capable of before the dawn of the world we know. The story is not finished. It may never be finished, but every new site excavated, every new pillar uncovered, every new carving revealed, adds a sentence to a narrative that was silent for 10,000 years and is only now beginning to be heard. Section 7. The Closing. There is a hill in southeastern Turkey that looks, from a distance, like any other hill, rounded, dry, covered in scrub grass and loose stone. Shepherds have grazed their flocks on its slopes for generations. Farmers have ploughed the fields around its base. The road from Şanlıurfa passes within a few kilometers. Nothing about the hill suggests that it is anything other than what it appears to be, a potbelly of earth rising from the Harran Plain, unremarkable and unnoticed. But beneath the surface of that hill lies one of the most important places on earth, a place where human beings, more than 11,000 years ago, proved something that we are only now beginning to understand, that the capacity for greatness is not a recent acquisition, that the desire to build, to gather, to create something larger than any individual life is as old as humanity itself, that the people who lived before agriculture, before cities, before writing, before all the markers that we use to define civilization, were not primitive, they were us. In every way that matters, they were us, with the same minds, the same hands, the same restless, irrepressible need to leave a mark on the world that will outlast the person who made it. The carved pillars of Gobekli Tepe stand in the earth where they were placed more than 115 centuries ago. The foxes still run across the stone, the vultures still spread their wings, the serpents still coil, the boars still bristle. These images were carved by people whose names we will never know, in a language we cannot reconstruct, for reasons we can only guess. But the images endure. They have outlasted every empire, every religion, every language, every political system that the human species has produced since they were carved. They are older than the pyramids, older than the first cities, older than written language, older than agriculture itself. And they were made by people we do not talk about. We should talk about them, because they are the beginning of our story, not the beginning that the textbooks describe, with the first seeds planted in the Fertile Crescent and the first cities rising on the banks of the Euphrates. An earlier beginning, a deeper beginning, a beginning that reaches back into a time before farming, before pottery, before metal, and finds there, in the darkness of the deep past, the same human impulse that would later build the pyramids and the cathedrals and the skyscrapers and the spacecraft. The impulse to create, to gather, to build, to leave something behind that says to anyone who might find it in the unimaginable future, we were here, we mattered, we made this. The people of Gobekli Tepe did not know that their monument would be buried for 10,000 years. They did not know that it would be found by a German archaeologist in the late 20th century, and that it would force a reconsideration of everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization. They did not know that their carvings would survive, while the civilizations that followed them would rise and fall, and be forgotten in their turn. They knew only what they knew, that the stone was there, that the tools were in their hands, that the images in their minds needed to be made real. And so they carved. The people of Gobekli Tepe had no writing, they had no metal, they had no pottery, they had no domestic animals, save possibly the dog. They had no agriculture, at least not when the first pillars were raised. By every conventional measure of civilization, they should not have been capable of building what they built, and yet they built it. With stone tools and human muscle, and artistic vision and organizational skill, and the kind of stubborn, generational persistence that is the deepest expression of what it means to be human. They built it because they needed to. Not needed in the sense of physical necessity. They were not building shelters or granaries or defensive walls. They were building meaning. They were creating a place where the community could come together, where the stories could be told, where the ancestors could be honored, where the bonds that held the community together could be renewed and strengthened. They were building the same thing that every subsequent civilization would build, from the temples of Sumer to the cathedrals of Europe, to the mosques of the Islamic world, to the concert halls and museums and public spaces of the modern era. They were building a place for people to gather and to share in something larger than themselves. The impulse to build such places is not a product of any particular stage of human development. It is a product of being human. It exists in us, all of us, as surely as the impulse to speak, to sing, to dance, to tell stories. It requires no technology beyond the simplest tools. It requires no economic system beyond the willingness to share labor. It requires only what the people of Gobekli Tepe had in abundance: the desire to create something that matters, the willingness to work for it, and the hope expressed in carved stone that someone, someday, would come and see what they had done and understand. The wind blows across Gobekli Tepe tonight, as it has blown for millennia beyond counting. The hill keeps its shape. The buried pillars hold their silence. The foxes and the vultures and the serpents wait, patient in the stone, for the next person who will come to look at them and wonder. They have been waiting for a very long time. They are not in a hurry. There is a final thought that the carved pillars of Gobekli Tepe offer to anyone willing to listen. It is a thought about time, about the vast, incomprehensible depths of time that separate us from the people who carved them. 115 centuries, more than 500 generations of human beings have been born, lived their lives, and died since those carvings were made. Each one of those generations had its own stories, its own struggles, its own understanding of the world. Each one believed itself to be at the center of history, and each one passed, leaving little or no trace, into the silence of the past. The pillars of Gobekli Tepe are one of the oldest surviving human-made structures on Earth. They have outlasted everything that was built for thousands of years after them. They have outlasted the first cities. They have outlasted the first empires. They have outlasted the first religions, the first written languages, the first legal codes. They stand as proof that human beings were capable of creating enduring things long before the dawn of everything we call civilization. And they stand as a reminder that the urge to create, to leave something behind, to make a mark on the world that outlasts the maker, is not a modern invention. It is as old as humanity itself, perhaps older. Perhaps it is the thing that makes us human. Somewhere beneath the hills of Turkey, beneath the jungles of Southeast Asia, beneath the savannas of Africa, beneath the waters of coastlines that were dry land, when Gobekli Tepe was young, there may be other monuments, other carvings, other evidence of human achievement from the ages before the ages we know. We have not found them yet. We may never find them. The earth is patient, and it keeps its secrets well. But Gobekli Tepe tells us to look. It tells us that the human story is longer and deeper and richer than we have been taught to believe. It tells us that the people who came before us, long before us, in the deep time, before Egypt, before Sumer, before everything we call civilization, were capable of greatness. And it tells us, in the silent language of carved stone, that greatness is not something we invented. It is something we have always been. The pillars stand. The carvings endure. And the civilization before the Egyptians, the one we do not talk about, waits quietly in the earth for the world to remember its name.